bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
I've been living here for about 18 years now, and so I guess I have some claim to being knowledgeable about what goes on here in Singapore schools, because that's where I work in an institution that's responsible for teacher education, and so I've sort of been doing that, and also combining that experience with the work that I do here in the church as a lay reader and as a discipleship leader. Hopefully I can bring all of this knowledge and experience together to present to you some ideas about how Christians might view a system of public education that exists here in Singapore. So I want to I can't go through the whole thing, and I don't think that would be right to do so, because then you won't want to be interested in purchasing your own copy of the book. So I can't do that. I can only give you kind of like, this is the advert for the book. So what I want to do really, I suppose, is try to answer a question, kind of like a self-imposed question, is what's my approach? And why am I adopting the approach that I'm taking? And then leave it up to you to read the material and then to let me know whether or not I've done what I'm setting out to do. So I need to spend a little bit of time just presenting some theory and about what education is, and then move on quickly to a critique of that theory and that thinking, in order then to provide a foundation for a perspective of education from a Christian viewpoint. And I can only do that sort of by actually presenting the case for a Christian viewpoint, from what I guess you could call like some familiar Christian distinctives, and then see how they apply to an educational context. And then I suppose the issue then is that if you agree with that way of thinking and those viewpoints, is, well then what are we going to do about it? Because it's all very well to talk, okay, but we really need to walk that talk, as it were. And I think that that's going to present us as Christians with a challenge, because the system that we're familiar with and the system that we know is not set up for this way of thinking necessarily. And I'll try to explain what I think those differences are and how they might be overcome or dealt with. So some sort of theories and practices then. I guess that there are numerous ways in which we can think about what education is and how education works. And the way that we define education, in a sense, tells us a lot about how we think education works and what the purposes of education are. And once we've got a viewpoint of that, then we start to get close to what we think knowledge is, how we think, where does knowledge come from, who is responsible for imparting knowledge to others, who has, in a sense, authority in those particular areas. And what we'll begin to see is that the people that decide what knowledge is also happen to be the people that decide what is right and true, and what is desirable to know. And so, we need to be very careful here, because very quickly we see that education is not some standalone concept, that can be defined and can be understood on its own and in its own terms. What actually happens is that education is actually mixed up with a lot of other things that are social, historical, cultural. They're also historical and economic and all kinds of other things, all wrapped up together. And so there's no neutral education argument. It's always going to be from some particular standpoint. For example, it could be, we think about education in order to make the world a better place. Okay, but but who defines what better is, and who defines what the place is? We might think that education is meant to make the world a happier place. But who decides what happiness is, and for what purposes? We might want to think about education as a way of preparing us to live in the world. But what is the world like, and what does living in that particular world look like, and what's desirable and what's not? These are all contentious issues that I think we very quickly have to deal with if we're interested in thinking about what functions education performs. So in the booklet, I can't do all of that in 50 pages. It would be impossible. There are education libraries that deal with all of this stuff, with large, philosophy sections about education, and I, sort of recommend that you look at those. But what I've tried to do is in order to get things going, in the booklet, is to look at two viewpoints and try to compare and contrast them, which is trying to look at educational purposes in terms of earning a living, and the other one, which is living a life. Now, earning a living, I think, and living a life aren't necessarily the same things, but it does come together in one way or another. Let me just tell you a little bit about what these viewpoints say. And again, the booklet tries to go into a bit more detail. When we look at education in terms of trying to earn a living, a lot of people view education as a way in which people can invest in themselves. So we invest our time, our money, our effort, for example, in our schooling, in our post-secondary schooling. So a lot of people will, for example, like I did, they will pay to do a master's degree, right? A lot of people like me are also paid to do a doctoral degree, in the hope that this kind of represents an investment in myself, and that after getting a PhD, I'm now in a sense more employable than I was when I only had a bachelor's degree, and that in a sense then that I make these investments in myself in order to make myself more marketable, make myself more attractive to potential employers. But not only do individuals do this, but also societies do this as well. So whole governments here will invest massive amounts of monies in an education system in order to, in a sense, grow the people. So education becomes an investment at the societal level, because the thinking is that a workforce that is educated and skilled is going to be attractive in a global sort of economic market, and that multinational companies, I hope this is sounding familiar, that multinational companies will want to invest in a place like Singapore, because this is the place where there's an educated workforce, and that only comes about because of these investments that have been made in education. So that's educational purpose then to earn a living. Then there's another one which is more pragmatic in a sense, which is being educated in order to live a life. And so what does it mean to live a life? Well, in the booklet, I tried to say a little bit about some of the viewpoints of an American philosopher, educational philosopher, John Dewey, and you might have heard of him. Dewey believed that we educate ourselves because we want to learn how to live. We want to learn how to understand and respond to our fellows, to other people. Life is our lives are lives that involve, for example, solving problems. And we can't solve problems unless we can communicate with other people, unless we can understand other people, unless we can have some way in which we can share our knowledge and our experiences of the world. And all of this, will help to improve our lives as a result of that. Education, fulfills a social, a cultural purpose, in a sense, and we can think about these purposes being reproduced over time, and so that there becomes a history of this, and so we learn from our parents, we learn from our grandparents about the ways in which they learned to communicate, and we begin to compare and contrast, and we learn about life, by being educated about life. So there's a lot more that can be said, but these are two viewpoints. Now, what I want to do very quickly is to present a critique. In educational terms, critiques aren't necessarily criticisms. A critique is a very nice, friendly way of actually sort of pointing out what might be some of the shortcomings of a particular way of thinking, but you don't have to take it personally. You don't have to. There's no reason to feel offended. This is just a way of looking at something to provoke some thought or to provoke some ideas. One of the things about, for example, thinking about an education where we try to prepare ourselves to become more marketable in the world. One of the problems with that is that our achievements aren't necessarily rewarded equally. So this is a critique of kind of like the meritocratic way of thinking. And I say that sort of carefully because it's not something that is not you can be questioned. The meritocratic way of thinking, because the thing is this: is that I can work very hard and I can work just as hard as anybody else, but that other person's achievements might be recognised and mine aren't. Right? Is that fair? I mean, don't I have an equal say? I mean, not everyone can be the Prime Minister, right? Because, definitionally, there can only be one Prime Minister, right? So somebody's achievements somewhere have had to be, not forgotten, but not taken into account so that people can rise to the top. In fact, if you think about it, people can only get at the top because there are others that are in the middle and at the bottom. Right? And so, the argument is, look, everybody reaches their level of attainments, depending not only on their effort and on their achievements, but also, I suppose, on who they are. Which leads me to the second point about investing in ourselves as if we were human capital or human resources, is that not all human capital is the same. So if I look into my pocket here and pull out my wallet, okay, and I see here I've got a $5 bill, right? Does anybody else have $5? Anybody else? Anybody else? Yeah, okay, Ezekiel, we'll do it with you. This is risky, but...
How much will it risk?
Yeah, okay, that's a calculated risk. Okay, remember that one was yours, right? Okay, my $5 and his, okay, mine worth more than his. Right? I'll tell you why. Okay, because I can spend my $5 in places where you can't go. And I'm guessing too, but in order to be equal and fair, okay, that you can do something with your $5 that I can't do with mine. So although numerically, okay, this is the same thing, all right, actually, the worth, in a sense, we know how much it's worth in terms of its dollar amount, but in a sense, the value of this currency depends on who you are and where you can go and what you can spend it on. You could put your $5 towards buying a yacht. I could put my $5 towards, sort of buying uploading my EasyLink card. So it kind of like, depends on where we go and what we do. Also, I think with the whole business of thinking about educating ourselves to live a life, is that taken like that from a kind of like secular viewpoint, there's no moral imperative. It's just kind of like we just do it because we feel as if it seems like it's the right thing to do, but there's nothing that's compelling us to do it. And so sometimes when you look at these courtesy campaigns, right, you give up your seat for somebody else. Why would you want to do it? It just doesn't make any sense, right? Without there being, there's no economic reason for doing it. There's no social or political reason for doing it. Why would you want to? There's no moral imperative there. And so we're just, we're kind of like depending on people's innate sense of what is good and right, but we can't depend on it. And so I think we've got to try and think about looking at life and looking at education that's more than just about performance and output. And we've got to think more about sort of outcomes And we've got to think, about what the opportunity cost might be in trying to work towards the achievement of those outcomes. And so that's why, I move on quickly to talk about some Christian distinctives. And I don't want to go over this because I don't think it's necessary, given this audience. But I think, what makes Christianity distinctive in a secular setting? Well, one of the things is that instead of trying to think about, grading or classing people in terms of their social class or what they've managed to achieve or what they do or where they work or what school they went to, we're all made in God's image. Right? And so in that sense, there's an equality, and there's that is pre-existing, and there's no need to prove or justify that. That is the way it is. That is the ontology of a Christian perspective. And we exist, not through our own effort, but we exist because of God's love for us. Right? It's unmerited, okay, and it's undeserved, but it's there, right? And so we don't need to work for that necessarily. We need to work it out, but not work for it. We're in this world, we know that, but we're not of it. Which in a sense gives us, there's a sense in which we can think of, well, that gives me a way of looking at things differently, because I can like step out of a secular point of thinking in order to look at things differently. Okay, and for us, okay, we don't need to think about human achievement, or we don't need to think about what we think is right and good. For us as Christians, only God's standards count and matter in this world. And so that kind of like puts it over, above our individual thinking and our perspectives here. And I think that that's important for us to know that. Okay, so what would, working towards thinking about kingdom purposes for education in a public context, what would be some of the things that would be important here? Well, I think these perspectives are. They can be argued for. It can be more than this. But in the booklet, I try and talk about 5 things that a kingdom perspective on education affords for us, to do with change, identity, wisdom, and maturity and knowledge, in terms of character development, and also in terms of leadership. And I think that although I haven't been sort of heavy in the booklet about this, I think that if somebody wanted to do a follow-up here, there are probably biblical references that could follow up and justify all of these things. But I've tried not to include that in the booklet. So what about change? Okay, very quickly. What is it about change? Well, change, definitionally, is all about transformation. It's a flow from one state to another that's either initiated by internal factors or external factors or forces, leading to a realignment of existing values, practices, and outcomes. Now, from a Christian perspective, what our distinctives allow us to do is to focus on what is important, as opposed to what is necessary and urgent. And we do this, not because it's something that's come from us, but we do it because we trust in a constant and loving God. That's why we do it. Okay, it's not something that we thought up on our own or for ourselves. It's that whole issue of trusting in God helps us, in a sense, to deal with change. And I think a lot of people that have trouble in the world today are people who have difficulty in trying to adapt to and cope with change. But I think from a Christian perspective, and trying to be hopeful and positive about this, I think Christians have a good basis for dealing with change because it helps them to prioritize and to get things that are important done. Similarly, with identity. For many, identity is an idiosyncratic human system of earned merit and achievement. But I don't think Christians necessarily have to worry about that, okay? Because what a Christian perspective allows us to do, and a Christian perspective on education allows us to do, is to try to understand, not who we are, but whose we are. Okay, and we work towards community interests because we share common characteristics, values, and interests. Right? There's more that unites us than divides us in that sense. What about these three? Wisdom, maturity, and knowledge. This is a big, this is a talk in itself. Okay, but wisdom, often seen as applied knowledge of what is right and true, but it begins with God and not with man. It's about thinking beyond our present situations and becoming more Christ-like as a result. If we can work towards wisdom and mature knowledge, okay, I think that there's a case for saying is that we would become, and this sort of is in Proverbs, but you'll see, more trustworthy, more shrewd in the sense of taking advantage of situations for God's purposes as opposed for our own, about helping us to become more generous, diligent, and well-spoken. Character. Well, again, definitionally, character, the mental and moral qualities that are distinctive to an individual, and involved here, I think, in equipping students to acquire and develop the attitudes and attributes that best serve the individual and the public good very well. Okay, but I think what a Christian perspective on education allows us to do is to think about some other things in terms of building self-control, truthfulness, patience, accepting responsibility for our actions, learning from mistakes, humility, accepting correction with a good attitude, and using our time and resources well. And of course, the booklet can't explain all of this in fine detail, but these are discussion points here that I offer to you, and ask that if we look at the education that for example our children receive, it can be turned towards these purposes if we look at things from a Christian viewpoint. That's what I'm trying to argue for. Leadership. Of course, defined as the capacity or the ability to direct and manage and govern, control and command, and often thought of in secular settings as the domain of trying to select a few people who can be groomed from their very early years. That's what we usually think of things. But I think that from a Christian perspective, I think that each and every one of us can be a leader and should be a leader, okay, in the situations where we are. This isn't for the select few. This is for everyone. Okay, and I think that that we can think about education in leadership terms, okay, in this particular way, because we do it not for ourselves, but for the glory of God. Okay, that's the kind of like the end of the preaching part. Okay, what about walking talk? Now this man, as you know, Gandhi, he is reputed as once saying to people that he liked Christianity, but he said, your Christians are so unlike your Christ. You'll find this on the web all over the place. What did Gandhi mean? I think what he meant, or what people think he was trying to say, because there's no known proof that Gandhi was an authority on Christian thinking, okay, but he said this anyway, is that Christians are known for not necessarily walking their own talk, in a sense that we're not consistent, we're hypocritical. So does that kind of like destroy everything that I've said so far? Well, we've got to find and know a way of countering this viewpoint here, because this could be a deal breaker, if we're not careful. So we know, as truly repenting Christians, right, we're painfully aware of our failings. Okay, well, what I want to argue for is this: is that we know of our failings and we constantly pray and ask for God's forgiveness. Right? Yet, what I want to argue here in favour for this Christian perspective of a kingdom view of education is that our wrongdoing doesn't necessarily violate God's standards. Right? Just because we can't meet those standards doesn't mean that those standards aren't right and true. it just provides a clear and a certain way, okay, of us to know about our fallenness and our wretchedness, okay, and to think about how things could be different and to work towards making things different. So when Gandhi said, your Christians are so unlike your Christ, he was right, okay, but for the wrong reasons. Right? He thought that he would be able to destroy Christianity. For us, this builds us up, because it should encourage us to do things differently. So what I want to say is this in the booklet, this central message here, is that while we Christians live and work towards the fundamentally eternal and things that are unseen, there's absolutely no conflict between a Christian view of education and public views of society and education. There's no conflict, but there is a huge difference, okay? And it's that difference, okay, that we need to work on and work towards, because a Christian view of public education is, by definition, going to be fundamentally and essentially countercultural, okay? But I would like to argue that it's not necessarily disruptive, okay? And so that's the space which we can claim and work in, and we need to do that, with a great deal of sensitivity. Nearly there at the end. So, what are some of the positive influences that could be gained, maybe, from a Christian perspective on education? In the booklet, I try and identify what some of these things might be. Of course, we've got to deal with this naive view, first of all, is that, how can it be possible that we can be good all of the time? Okay, we've got to be able to deal with that. Okay, we've got to be able to think about, where love, care, and faith, fit into our world views. We've got to be able to know and give informed responses to issues in the public square that lead to decision making and choice making. And I think that we can use, the material that's provided through public education for those purposes. It's going to help us know who we are and help us to possess a willingness to act for principled reasons, right? We give up our seat on the train, okay, because okay. We understand what knowledge is, and we also know how it's taught and learnt, okay? And we have a desire to learn and a curiosity for its own sake. Okay. Now, what the Christian view of public education can be, I think, is that we strive for what we can't see, but also we do that so that we move beyond ourselves. This is the Deweyan argument, sort of writ large, which is we do it, through education we attempt to improve ourselves and society because we're constantly attempting to move beyond ourselves. That's the improvement that takes place. Nearly finished. Okay. So the question is this: are we ready to do all of that? Okay. And I end the booklet by trying to say that we can be ready for these types of things, but we've got to adopt a particular point of view, which you can read about as you go through the material.